everybody, this is Laura. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have a layout that I made using the Shimmerz Color Kitz collection from March. I'm also using the cut file for the kit, and it says hopping down the bunny trail, which is perfect because I'm going to be scrapbooking photos of my daughter's rabbit. Usually I leave the cut file white, but I decided I wanted to try something a little bit different on this layout. So I am using some of my Shimmerz paints, and I'm going to be creating an ombre going from lighter on the top to darker on the bottom. I'm using two different colors to create this ombre. The lighter color is called Pink Caviar, that's a Shimmerz, and then I'm also using a Vibez called Quit Your Whinin'. So to make it lighter on the top and a little bit darker on the bottom, I am gradually mixing the darker color together with the lighter color. And then I add a little bit of water to help mix them together. As I work my way to the bottom, I use more and more of the darker color until I get to the very bottom, and then it's only the darker color, Quit Your Whinin'. Both of these colors are included in the Shimmerz March Color Kits collection. I don't want to forget to mention that if you use my name in the comments box when you place your order with Shimmerz, you'll receive a free gift. I also wanted to mention that this video is a little bit longer than most of my videos. I usually try to keep them around 15 or 16 minutes maximum, but I try to cut out footage that I didn't think was absolutely necessary, and I also sped the video up quite a bit, but I still found myself with a longer video. So sometimes I might be showing more of the process than you would like to see, but I know that some people really want to see that. I know when I'm watching a video and people are using paints and other mixed media, I like to see the whole process. There are a lot of components to this layout, and I wanted to show you as much as I could of all of the creation process. In my attempt to make the cut file go from lighter to darker, I added another layer of the pink caviar on the bottom half of the top row of letters, and then some on the middle row as well. And even though it was a very subtle ombre, I'm glad that I tried it out. Now I'm going to back the cut file. This was very simple. I just took one of the pieces of pattern paper from the kit and I cut it out using this cut file. Although before I cut it out, I removed all of the inner cuts, so it would just cut out as a solid piece. I use my Silhouette Cameo. I release the compound path on the cut file, and then I just drag all of those inner cuts to the side, and then I cut out the entire cut file without the inner cuts, and then I used gel glue and I glued my cut file on top of that backing. And that's an extremely easy way to back a cut file. I usually like to mix up the pattern papers and include a few of them on the cut file, but because I knew that I was going to have a lot of mixed media elements on this layout, I didn't want there to be too many different patterns. So I thought that just using that one pattern paper would work out best. I wanted to have a number of branches on my layout, so I used a set of 2 branch dies and some cold press watercolor paper. It was very inexpensive, and I cut out a number of branches. And I used some of my Shimmerz paints. The main paint that I used was Spruce It Up. That's a Shimmerz that's in this month's kit. And I made the color a little bit richer by applying a couple of layers to each of the branches. I mix some water in because I want there to be some variation in the color. I don't just want to paint them a solid green. I want there to be some lighter areas and some darker areas. So I started off by adding color to the entire die cut by kind of dipping them and smushing them in the paint that I had on my glass mat. And then I used my paintbrush to add some darker areas on each of the branches. I wanted to add in some touches of yellow, so I'm using a Shimmerz Paints color splash called Squeeze the Day. And while it looks like I'm just being really messy, I didn't mind if the yellow paint mixed with the green paint. I wanted there to be a whole range of different shades of green, so I added yellow mixed with green, and then I went back and I added a number of splatters. For the first round of splatters, I use my spray bottle and I spray a little bit of water to help the yellow mix in with the green paint, which isn't fully dry. And now I'm adding some yellow splatters without the water. You will see, though, that on the final leaves, you won't see any obvious splatters of yellow. Everything looks pretty green because I go back and add a little bit more green to each of the branches. And here I'm adding lots of splatters of green with the spruce it up. And I think that this adds a really nice, realistic touch to the branches. I wanted to mention that it's definitely not necessary to add so many layers to die cuts if you want to include them on your layout. I personally really enjoy doing this. This is really fun for me. I love building up the layers and adding splatters and adding different colors, but it can be done much more simply. One thing I think it's important to keep in mind is that you really can't go wrong with a process like this. I have made branches using Shimmerz Paints so many times, and I've used different colors every time, and they always turn out just fine. I think it's a really fun process, and I think that it's a good time to experiment, because if you don't like what you did, you could always add more paint and get it back to the color that you want it to be. The finished product of the layout is, of course, really important to all of us, but the process is really important too. I think that's the part that gives me the most joy, so I think it's a good time to have fun and experiment. To finish off those branches, I used a color splash called Whites of Their Eyes, just to add a couple of white splatters into the mix. The branches are all done now. They're off to the side, and I'm starting to work on some flowers. So I once again used 2 dies from my stash to create these flowers, and I once again cut them out of some inexpensive watercolor paper. I coated the flowers that I'm painting yellow with the Color Splash Squeeze the Day, the same color that I used on the branches earlier. And then, because I wanted the centers of the flowers to be a little bit darker, I used a Shimmerz called Bumbly Bee, and I added just a little touch of that to the centers of the flowers. Then I sprayed a little bit of water on the flowers, and that helps the Bumbly Bee color to spread out a little bit. I didn't want there to be a clear line between the 2 different colors of yellow, and this helps to prevent that. I also wanted to have some pink flowers on the layout. So I used those same die cuts, and I added the pink caviar shimmers on the entire die cut. I added another layer in the central area of the flower. And then to create even a little bit darker color, I used a drop of Quit Your Whinin', and I put that just in the very center of each of the flowers. Here I'm using some of the pink caviar, and I'm spreading that color out a little bit on some of the flowers. And then I added another little touch of the Quit Your Whinin' as a second layer. With watercolor paper, colors will usually dry a little bit lighter, and so I wanted to make sure there was enough concentration of color that this color would still be noticeable when the flowers dried. Whenever I create die cuts like this, I always like to ink the edges with Distress Oxides. I'm using forest moss for the branches, and I'm doing my best to get into all of those little crevices and areas between the leaves with my dauber. I wanted to do the same thing for each of the flowers. For the pink flowers, I use Victorian velvet, and for the yellow flowers, I use fossilized amber. In a few moments, I'm going to be adding a layer of gel medium to all of the branches and all of the flowers. And I think that a little bit of this Distress Oxide comes off when I add that, but I still think that enough of it remains to make it worth the process. So I'm using some Liquitex Gloss Gel Medium. I tried this a few layouts back, and I really liked the results, so I decided to do the same thing. It adds a little bit of a sheen to the flowers and the branches. I allowed all of those embellishments to dry, and now you can see them over to the left-hand side of my mat. Now I'm going to create a mixed media background for my layout. I have my 2 photos of my daughter's rabbit, and then I have the cut file. I used a pencil to just roughly mark where those are going to be on the layout so I know where to put the color. I'm using a piece of 120-pound smooth white cardstock that I have already coated with some Liquitex gesso. I'm using my favorite method of applying the color, which is the packaging technique, just putting some of the paint on the plastic and then squishing it down on the paper. The color that I'm using is a Shimmerz paint called Me in Blue. That's an Inklingz. And you can see that I'm adding it directly from the container with my paintbrush and putting it on the plastic and then adding it to the background. I'm trying to cover the entire area where I'm going to have the cut file and extending the color out just a little bit. And I'm doing the same thing with the photos. I want the color to go just a little bit past where the photos are going to be on the layout. I know that it's usually Peter Cottontail hopping down the bunny trail, but in this case, it's my daughter's rabbit. This rabbit was named Skitsy. I had rabbits when I was little, but they were always kept outside and we probably didn't give them the attention that they needed. This rabbit was kept inside, and when my daughter went away to college, I really bonded with this little bunny, and I never realized how amazing they could be, what wonderful pets they are. When she was outside of her cage, she'd be hopping around, and anytime I called her, she would come running, and she was just such a cute little bunny. One time I called her, she didn't come, and it turned out she was kind of stuck behind a piece of furniture, and my husband and I had to move the furniture to get her out. We were a little more careful after that about where she went, but she was just wonderful, and I would have another rabbit again in a heartbeat. Right now we have 3 dogs, so that's plenty for us. But I would definitely consider getting another rabbit, although I know every animal is different, has their own personality, but I am just in love with this little rabbit, and I'm so happy that we got her. In addition to the color Me and Blue, I added a color splash called Sea Breeze. I wanted to add a second color of blue, just to add a little bit of variation. I put some on the plastic and I spread it around, and I liked the way that looked. I wanted to make sure that I felt that the 2 colors worked well together before I started adding lots of the sea breeze all over the background. And I did think that it was a good combination, so I decided that I was going to add more of the sea breeze. On that particular application, I added both the sea breeze and the Me and Blue. And then I wanted to add even more of the sea breeze color. I thought it was a nice bright color that went really well with the pink and the yellow flowers that I'm going to be adding. So I added lots and lots of splatters of sea breeze all around that blue area in the background. There's something about splatters that I just love. I love the randomness of them, and there's just some quality about them that I think adds a lot to backgrounds. And the splattering goes on for a little while, so I didn't include all of the footage, but you could see that I have quite a few of those blue splatters on the background. And now I'm adding some white splatters. You saw that just briefly. I added some color splash whites of their eyes just to add a little touch of white in the background. Here are 2 of the pattern papers from the kit. There's this pretty pink and green colored pattern papers. I'm going to use 1 on each of the photos. I have my photos mounted on some white cardstock, and then I'm mounting them on this pattern paper just to add a little bit of color all around my photos. I like to ink the edges, so I used Forest Moss and Victorian Velvet Distress Oxides to add a little bit of shading to the edges. So now I have my background done, I have my 2 photos, and I stitched all around the inside of the cut file, right inside the outline of the letters. I used a back stitch and some white embroidery thread, and I think that adds a nice bit of texture to the cut file and the layout. I attach my photos down on the upper right-hand corner. I'm going to make the one on the right a little bit higher than the one on the left, just to add a little bit of interest to the page. And now I'm going to bring all of those elements that I created earlier onto the layout. And this is one of my favorite parts of making the layout. I can see that I'm happy with the major elements on the page, and now I get to embellish. I'm adding a whole bunch of those branches. I'm putting them in a number of different spots on the layout. Mainly I'm putting them to the left of the photo and then to the lower right-hand side of the cut file. And then I add a couple more branches on top of the photos. And then I'm also going to put another small branch to the left of the T in trail, but I Haven't decided to do that just yet. And then I attach them down because I'm happy where they are and I don't want to move them around by accident. Usually I will wait a little bit longer, but because I'm going to be adding flowers on top, I didn't want to have to remove the flowers in order to attach them down. And because I'm using ATG adhesive, I can always adjust them or even take them off and reposition them if I want to. So I add that little sprig to the left of the letter T, and I cut my background down just a little bit because I wanted to add a little bit of pattern paper all around the outside. So I gutted this really pretty piece of flowered paper, and then I'm inking the edges of the mixed media paper with some Victorian Velvet Distress Oxide. And now I'm going to attach that down. I put a whole lot of ATG adhesive on the back of the layout so that it will stay put, but I also want to make sure that I have it positioned correctly before I press it down, because once this is pressed down without much adhesive, it's going to be really hard to adjust it. I'm adding some elements from the kit. I add these really cute little butterflies. I have one on the bottom and two on the upper left-hand corner. There was a little bit more open space in the upper left-hand corner, so that's why I decided to put two there. And then the other one where there was a little bit less space. And now I'm adding those pink and yellow flowers onto the layout. I'm just spreading them all around the areas, mainly where I have the leaves, but I put them in a couple of other areas as well. I know very little about flowers and plants. It's really not my area of expertise. I don't know if these leaves represent real life leaves or they're just stylized, and the same thing for the flowers, but I thought that visually they looked nice together, so I just combined them. And that's usually how I work with flowers and leaves. I don't really think about whether the flowers and the leaves actually go together unless it's something like roses or some really highly recognizable flower. And so I just went with it, and I think that it's a good combination for this layout. But I sometimes think that somebody who does know a lot about flowers is probably wondering why I'm combining some elements on some of my layouts. I added some flowers that were from the kit to the left of the photo cluster. And then I wanted to add these really cute bunnies to the layout. There were so many adorable die-cut rabbits. I wanted to add all of them, but I also didn't want to overload the page. So I picked out 3 of them and I put them on the layout, one on the top, one on the bottom left, one on the bottom right. And I just picked out rabbits that fit in the spaces that I had available, and I really like them, and I think that they are just adorable. Next, I added 3 little die-cut flower clusters, one by each of the bunnies. I think they're tulips, not 100% sure, but I thought that they looked cute. And then I added some fussy cut flowers to the centers of some of the letters. I'm always looking for more places to add flowers on the page. I don't end up leaving those there. I say this all the time. I don't think that they look too bad when I look at them now, but at the time I wasn't really crazy about them, so I'll end up moving those around on the layout. But first I felt compelled to add some stitching around the outside of the layout. It just seemed like the layout wouldn't be complete without the stitching around the outside. So I punched some holes and I did a back stitch. Earlier, I added some photo corners. I punched them out using an EK Success punch. I inked the edges and I attached them to any of the corners that I thought would be visible. Now I'm removing those flowers. I think my thought process was that they just made the layout a little bit too busy, and I liked those areas in the letters that were a little more plain and didn't look so highly embellished. So I think that those flowers looked better moved out and incorporated into all of those flower clusters. I like to finish off my layouts with little embellishments like pearls or enamel dots. For this layout, I'm using a variety of different pearls. I started off with some very tiny pearls, and I put 2 of them in the centers of each of those 3 butterflies. I also included some pearls on the photo corners, just because I think that's a nice little finishing detail. In addition to the white pearls, I added some small pink pearls to the centers of some of the flowers, and all of these pearls are self-adhesive. I also wanted to add some jewels. I had these Picket Fence Studios crystalline diamonds in pink sapphire. So I used my glossy accents and I attached some of those to the centers of some of the pink flowers. And then I went back to the pearls and added a really, really tiny pink pearl to the centers of those smallest flowers on the layout. This layout is complete. Thank you so much for watching. Check out the Shimmerz color kits. The link is in the description box. I hope you have a fantastic day and a happy Easter if you're celebrating. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.